Dave Sugden is a lifelong friend of mine. He's a business trial attorney at Dave. Hold on, man. I've got the firm. I only think of you. Call and Jenkins.
Dave? And Jensen.
Jensen. Look at you. You got a whole suit on. Oh, my gosh. Super professional. I've known Dave my entire life, or not my entire life, since college. He played baseball at Pepperdine. He's one of my good friends. We get together for breakfast every once in a while, and when we do, I say, man, why don't you come on my show? We should have some of these same conversations. And I mean it when I say this. Dave is, like, in my estimation, pioneered a unique career that all of us wanted to have, whoever went to law school. You know, grew up with either dads that were trial lawyers. We're all too young to watch Perry Mason, but we all watched drama about the courtroom. We wanted to be in the courtroom. And very few lawyers are actually in the courtroom. And Dave is on a continuous basis. He literally tries cases, takes them up late in the stage of litigation, and he's in the courtroom. And so Dave and I, what we end up talking about all the time is, you know, the nature of cross-examination, the way juries think, the way people think, and his window into how people think based upon seeing them make decisions in a courtroom. So when I say I think he's one of America's best trial lawyers, it's not just because I've known him for 20 some odd years, because I really mean that, and I've had the opportunity to hear his thoughts over steak and eggs. So, Dave, first of all, awesome to have finally done this.
Yeah.
Tell me what your thoughts are on this news. First of all, that Donald Trump had a $454 million bond today that's now been lowered to $175 million.
Yes. Well, what we're seeing in this bond issue is sort of a continuation of what seems like almost an upside down case. And when you look at the theory of Letitia James and her team, and now you look at the bond issue, what you're seeing is, in terms of her theory of the case, the idea was Trump isn't as wealthy as he says he is. He should not be allowed to deal with banks. He should not be allowed to engage in any more real estate transactions at all. She sought a lifetime ban. And then when you look at the briefing as to why he should get a bond, what she says is he can go to a bank, he can get a loan, he can sell his properties. And so she's saying, in essence, our lawsuit was designed to stop what we're saying he should do now. And so now we have the Court of Appeals saying we're going to reduce it, which doesn't, I don't think, change much for 10 days, other than it's probably more easy for Trump and his team to get a bond.
And so, and by the way, and just to revisit the facts of the case, the allegations are that Donald Trump inappropriately inflated the value of his various real estate properties in order to negotiate a more favorable loan to a bank. Now, every real estate friend I've said says, so does everybody. Like, that's the normal course of business. Like, get the highest valuation you can in front of a bank for your existing properties to increase the value or the ability of you to get the loan you desire. But then there's the bank on the other side, and they go, no, we don't think it's worth that. We don't think it's worth X. We think it's worth Y. They do their own due diligence. It's a negotiation, which happened in this case, and none of the banks feel like victims. But so Letitia James takes a normal business practice of the negotiation of value of an asset and turns it into a crime.
Well, it's so strange because when you think of the priorities of a state attorney general, protecting banks and insurance companies is usually not high on the priority list. In other words, they're designed to protect consumers, protect the public. And it's not as though these banks are super unsophisticated when it comes to giving out 9-figure loans. They do their due diligence. And so it's a bit of a head scratcher when you see a state attorney general saying, I'm going to go after this private transaction and seek the equivalent of a civil conviction.
And you think it being reduced to $175 million, he has 10 days. The thing is, none of us know what his, real asset sheet looks like, how liquid he is. We don't know any of that. So like you said, the only real takeaway from this at this point is, well, it's a lower number, so it's easier for him to satisfy that judgment. Do you think anything else would happen in the next 10 days legally to affect his necessity to pay $175 million?
I don't anticipate much will happen legally in the next 10 days. I mean, the briefing is essentially done. I imagine they may file some additional briefs asking again, but I imagine that now that the Court of Appeal has spoken, this is the number, this is the deadline. The question becomes, if he doesn't post a bond by that date, what happens next?
Right. And the same question we were asking today when the number was 454 million. All right. I want to ask you, I just want to bring the audience into some of our conversations. And it's always hard to recreate a conversation. But it was last week we were having breakfast, and you were telling me about one of the things you guys do to prepare for trial is you do mock trials and you impanel mock juries. And we were talking about the way it goes down in a jury room after the case is over. And how a jury makes up his mind. And it just blew my mind, but it also then made me think about us as individuals and us as a society. So just like share with us that story you were talking about of how quickly a jury comes to a conclusion.
Sure. So what we'll do is that we will do a sort of a mock jury exercise. And what we do is we present the case, a case that we're going to have and we're going to try it in the future. And what we want to do is see what is a jury going to do with our case. And so what we will do is we will get, it's essentially a focus group where we'll get anywhere from 24 to 30 people, and we'll give a presentation, a plaintiff presentation, a defense presentation, and a rebuttal by the plaintiff. And each individual will have an iPad, and he or she will sort of give their thoughts on the case, and they will render their verdict individually. And then what happens next is you divide the group into two rooms. And then with a two-way mirror, we're able to essentially review and watch how the deliberations go down. And what I was sharing with you, Will, is fascinating. The way it's not really a deliberation, but rather what you see is the strong personalities sort of dictate what's going to happen. And so it's not uncommon. We've had this recently where in room number 1, we have a defense verdict. In room number 2, we have a plaintiff verdict, and it's multi-millions in terms of what the verdict is. And these two groups saw the same thing, saw the exact same thing. And so what you see is how that decision gets made. And what you often see is as the dialogue begins, the strong personalities, the leaders in the room sort of emerge. And then as a result, people sort of follow along and they want to sort of fit in and they want to have connection. And so in room number 1, you have someone that says, oh, I think it's a defense verdict. And here's why I think it's a defense verdict. What do you think? And all of a sudden people start sort of gravitating towards that verdict. And in the other room, you see the absolute opposite take place. And it's not unlike your prior guest, Clifton Duncton, where he talks about how because he was sort of thinking a different way on certain issues, he sort of feels excluded. And what you see in these deliberations is the fear of exclusion, where someone has said, I think this, here's why. And once people start sensing there's agreement, consensus happens pretty fast.
You told me like in 5 minutes. Like you told me a story of one of those rooms, the first person to speak was sort of, I hope I'm not divulging anything you didn't want me to tell you, but like, you know, kind of purple haired, nose ring. And you told me that her major desire when she was speaking was to not be speaking, that she did not want to go first. She didn't want to stake a position. And then the second speaker was a strong personality guy. And you said to yourself, literally 5 minutes into deliberation, you turned to your friends or colleagues, you're like, game, set, match. It's over. Second dude spoke, and everyone will go that way.
Yes. And so what we saw is sort of a personality where this person was asked to go first, and you could tell there was profound discomfort. This person did not want to sort of stake her position. And so she sort of gave a waffly answer. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. What do you think? And so she sort of not wanting to take a position, again, in a cynical way, fear of rejection, in a less cynical way, desire for human connection. And so then what happens is you see the individual who's much stronger, who says, I feel strongly this way, this is why I think that, and then all of a sudden I sort of joked and said, game, set, match. And what you're going to see is most of the folks sort of following along. And then what happens is that each room continues the discussion, and what they're doing is they're not looking to poke holes or weaknesses in their deliberation, but rather what they're sharing are things that now confirm what they believe to be true. And so when you watch each room, if you were just an observer who hadn't watched the presentations, you would think you would have thought these are totally different cases, because in room 1, they've got a memory that confirms the bias of their defense verdict. On the other hand, in another room, they're saying, oh, this is clearly a strong case for the plaintiff, and here's why.
And I asked you, in all your years of doing this, And I'm going to get to why this is important in a minute. Like, I'm fascinated by this, because I'm interested in rhetoric and logic and persuasion. I'm interested in the law and trials, but also I actually think this is what we're talking about is not just a focus group for a trial, but a focus group for all of us as society and how we coalesce and how we make decisions. So, and then I think you could even apply it individually to how we interact individually with one another. Like Dave and I've talked about how you persuade your kids based upon understanding what people do here. Like, so I just think it's applicable in any walk of life. And I asked you, in all your years of doing this, have you ever seen a 12 Angry Men situation where it's like 11 people ready to go and one holdout? And your answer was never.
Never. It doesn't happen, at least not in these focus groups. It just does not. And it's not to say there couldn't be a situation where someone is sort of an independent thinker and truly wants to not fit in. I don't want to be overly cynical, but what you do see is the strong pull of people wanting to connect, wanting to share things in common. And what you see is a lot of following. It just sort of inevitably happens. And what you and I talked about, Will, is also the idea of how do people come to decisions. And Will, you went to law school, so did I, and we spent 3 years sort of learning how to think with our minds. In other words, how to think logically. And we sort of exit law school thinking, well, I now know how to argue logically. That means I must now be persuasive. And I'll try to persuade through logic. And what my experience has been, I think we see this in politics everywhere, is that people make decisions first off how they feel. There's sort of a gut reaction to something they hear, something they feel, and then after that, they sort of use their mind to rationalize their decision, rationalize what they're feeling. And so people aren't consciously in a deliberation saying, I want to fit in, therefore I will follow this person. But rather, there's sort of this idea of what do I feel? How do I feel about this argument? And then to sort of reconcile that, they'll use their mind to explain how they got there. And so oftentimes after a trial, we will talk to jurors afterwards, and what we will get is really good explanations that sound logical and they follow the evidence, they follow the law, and they explain how they got there. But the real question is, how did they first decide in their gut which way they are going? How do they feel? Because a lot of times that can trigger how they're going to rationalize their ultimate decision.
So you're exactly right. And in that, for most of my career, and for anyone watching, I think the hard thing to do is to separate the world and the way it is from the way that you think the world should be. And you're right, for a lot of us that come out of law school, and certainly for me, I think the world should operate by reason and logic. But that can't push me into a situation of thinking that's the way the world does work, just because I think it should work that way. And so, I've become much more humble in I know that sounds ridiculous, but I've become much more humble in making arguments and understanding. Like I told you, Dave, when I was at CNN as a contributor, and even in my early days at ESPN, I was just a jackhammer for logic. It's just like, you're wrong, boom, 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 here's why. And I think I just become more humble on the limitations of that as a tool of persuasion. It doesn't make you wrong, but you also aren't as effective in convincing people you are right. And so what I'm getting at, and I'm pretty honest with my audience, I don't do things in a calculated nature, or at least not consciously. I don't know about subconsciously, but I don't sit there and go, how can I make this argument most persuasive? I just kind of do what comes naturally. You have to think that way a little more because your job is more overtly to persuade 12 people. How do you use that, Dave? Or even, you and I talk about our personal lives. We talk about our families, and wives and children. Anyone listening, bosses, I don't even know if you're trying to actually use this information and use this. I don't even know how you begin to say, all right, well, if it's not logic, which one can understand, now I have to understand the way people feel at all times and how logic fits into how they feel. I don't know how you turn that into, and it sounds cynical to say a tool, but into a tool for persuasion.
Well, I think it's a matter of sort of understanding human nature. In other words, we can, as lawyers, think, hey, here's why I'm logically right. Here's why the facts and the law match, and here's why I'm going to win. But the reality is that the decision maker, whether it's a jury, your boss, your spouse, they have to want to have a reason to find in your favor. And so a lot of times you have to, as a lawyer, think of, okay, I understand what the facts are, but what's the story that I can tell? That's always true, that aligns with the evidence. But when I tell this story, it's going to make the jurors feel a certain way where they want my side to win. A lot of times in these civil cases, there aren't that many facts in dispute, but what you do see is sort of the competition of ideas, where the plaintiff will have one certain narrative. In other words, once upon a time, there was this plaintiff who, until the defendant did this bad thing, this happened, and now you as the jury can fix all of that. Now, if the defendant gets up there and says, well, there's no causation. In fact, what you're going to see is that there may have been a number of different causes as to why this person's injured, or whatever. What you have is a narrative by the plaintiff that tells a story. And the jury's going to hear that and think, I feel something. I'm very sympathetic to what happened to this plaintiff. Meanwhile, this defendant has sort of a technical argument that's just not going to stick. It's sort of like your CNN days. In other words, if a person wants to think something and you're going with logic, you're not going to sway them away. Whereas if a defendant has an alternative narrative, this is what the case is about. This is about a plaintiff that could have been more responsible or whatever. You're at least providing competing stories so that you can get to the sort of gut and hearts of the jurors so that you've at least given them a chance to feel a certain way, and then they're more likely to listen to your logical arguments. If you lead with logic, they won't be listening at all.
There's some like ancient metaphor about that, like it's easier to steer an elephant by the nose than it is by the head, or something like that. That has to do with reason versus emotion. I don't know, man. I love every conversation we have. You know that. At some point, I want to share it with the audience as well. And I think there's so much to learn about the way we as individuals make decisions. As you said, the desire to fit in. I've come to believe that fear is the biggest motivator, and I guess that's a fear of ostracization that people are fighting. They want to be accepted in part of the group. But then also just like, I don't know, politics, life, how you communicate, how we communicate with one another and try to convince each other of objective truth. All right, Call Jensen is his firm. Dave Sugden, business trial lawyer, one of the best. By the way, he educates lawyers at evidenceattrial.com. I'll meet you for breakfast, and let's do this again on the Will Cain Show, man. Love it. Thank you, buddy.